Hey, everybody. Happy Sunday. Just kind of giving people a second to get logged on. I know I'm a little bit late for our weekly AP Lang Q&A. Got kind of caught up with some stuff, but I'm here, happy to answer questions if people have them. So if you are a student who's taking the AP Lang exam and you have questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'd be happy to answer them. So we are like 73, I think, days away from the AP Lang test. So definitely got some time, but this is around the time when students start to ask a lot of the same questions. So while I'm waiting for some questions to come in, I figured I would answer some of the ones that are like most common at this point in the year. So if you're just joining, feel free to ask questions in the chat because I know there's a lot of questions and concerns about AP Lang. And if you are an AP Lang student, we're going to go over some of the most common AP Lang questions at this point in the year. I think one of the big questions that a lot of students have right now is things like, how many paragraphs do I need to write and how do I pace myself for the exam? So if that's a question you have, let's talk about it. For each of the 3 AP Lang FRQs, honestly, you just need a short intro. That's where you're going to get your thesis point, hopefully. And then 2 body paragraphs is totally okay. I had this conversation with a tutoring student recently. We were talking about how, sometimes there's a lot of pressure to write 3 body paragraphs because students kind of think, I need 3, the whole 5-paragraph essay kind of thing. And honestly, that's not the case. 2 body paragraphs on the AP Lang exam is totally fine, especially if you develop those paragraphs well. So for your timed writings and stuff, make sure that you're developing those thoughts. And also, a conclusion is not necessary. That's one of the other really common questions that I get asked at this point in the year is like, do I need a conclusion for my AP Lang essay? And honestly, the answer is no. Can it be helpful? Yes, absolutely. But if you are like struggling with your time management for AP Lang essays, then definitely maybe consider not having a conclusion if you're worried about your pacing because you don't really get points for the conclusion. Maybe the sophistication point if your essay is super good, but other than that, not necessarily. So if you're just joining, welcome. My name is Coach Hall. I'm an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas. And each week I go live on TikTok and YouTube to do a basically like a Q&A for students. So if you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments and I would be happy to answer them. We're just kind of chatting about some questions that students have around this point in the year because we're 73 days, I think, away from the AP Lang test. So if you're on TikTok, do me a huge favor and tap your screen to give this some likes because that'll push it out to other students as well. And yeah, have at it. Leave some questions in the comments. So as you are preparing for the upcoming AP Lang exam, there are some things that you can be doing that aren't super difficult if you're trying to prepare. So if you're trying to get ready and you're also studying for like the SAT or the ACT, that can help with your multiple choice. If you're doing writing in class, thank you for the likes on TikTok. That can help as well. Like seriously, take those timed write situations seriously if you can. And apply the feedback that you're given. Okay, someone said top tips for a synthesis essay. Okay, so the big thing that I see, I'm actually working on a video. I'm hoping to have it edited tonight where it's like common mistakes. Because that was a question someone asked a couple weeks ago that I thought was a really good question. Is like, what are the common mistakes you see? For synthesis, one of the big issues that I see sometimes is students try to have like one source per paragraph. So they might have like 3 body paragraphs and it's just one source in each one. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it makes your essay feel really disjointed. And so if you could have 2 sources put in conversation with each other in each paragraph, that can help. So for instance, remember that you need 3 sources. So you could have like, let's just say for the sake of exemplification, A and B in one paragraph. You could do B and C in the next one. A, B, and C, you've got 3 sources. So it's okay to reuse the same source, but it still only counts as one. But it's always kind of a little bit of a red flag to me when I see an essay where it's like body paragraph 1 has one source, body paragraph 2, another source, body paragraph 3, a third source, because it kind of feels like you're just summarizing the sources. It doesn't mean that you're not going to score well, but it tends to feel like the essay is disjointed. So that would be one tip for synthesis is to really think about how the sources interact. Also, I say this in a lot of my videos, but you want layers of evidence and commentary. So what I mean by that is, generally speaking, you're going to have a topic sentence, which is your claim. That's your main idea. and then evidence. Then you want commentary that's going to really explain the significance of your evidence. So ask yourself why, how, so what. For synthesis, you really want to think about, why does this issue matter? So like, who is impacted by this? Are they benefiting? Are they harmed by it? You can think about like the short-term impact, the long-term impact. If you're analyzing like statistics or something, what do these statistics actually show us? Because remember, for synthesis, depending on which prompt we're talking about, you might have statistics or facts or real world examples. I tell my students to prioritize those because it helps make your argument more logical. But we want to figure out, okay, like, why does the statistic matter? Or if it's a real world example, why does this matter? And how could it apply to like other communities or other societies? And things like that. So definitely have commentary. And then you want to have another layer of evidence and commentary if possible. And then a concluding sentence kind of wraps everything up. So yeah, that would be my top tip for synthesis, is try to put 2 sources in a paragraph if you can. It's not mandatory, it's just a recommendation. Make sure you have enough commentary. And then also I would say for synthesis, with your commentary, try to think about the big picture of the issue too. That may lead to sophistication, it may not, but it'll at least help your commentary. Okay, so I see some questions coming in over here on TikTok as well. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat. And if you're on TikTok, thank you for the likes. Please keep tapping your screen. It helps like let other people know as well, because I go live each week. I'm a little bit late this week. Something came up, but I try to go live at 3 p.m. Eastern each Sunday. Okay, so someone wants to know the difference between AP Lit and AP Lang. That's a great question. Simply put, AP Lang in most schools is first, not always, but it's usually for juniors. It is studying nonfiction. I think it's a very valuable class, and I'm not just saying that because I teach it. If you're looking to prepare for the higher level writing that you might see in college, I think AP Lang is very beneficial. AP Lit, also a good class. It's more like about fiction. So the skills that you learn in AP Lang, you learn how to write, you learn how to argue well, you learn how to do research. AP Lit focuses on poetry, short fiction, and novels. So good class. But it's like more, just as someone who was an English major, the stuff that we cover in AP Lit is more like the stuff that I did as an English major in college. But for a lot of my students who go into things like pre-med or kinesiology or political science, like the type of writing they do, they rely way more on those AP Lang skills, not the AP Lit skills. Not to knock poetry or anything, but depending on what you major in college, you might not need to know how to analyze a poem, but you probably will need to know how to write a research paper. So that's the difference, is Lang is nonfiction, Lit is fiction and poetry. Will the multiple choice be regarding English rules and writing, or about an article we'll read? Okay, so let me break down the multiple choice real quick, because they changed it. It was like it was supposed to be 2020, but then COVID happened. So 2021 was the first time that we actually had that type of question on the exam. So for the multiple choice, you are going to get 1 hour to answer 45 questions. It also happens to be 45% of your composite. So the composite score is like the score 1 through 5. That's the part that you can send to colleges. So you don't get to find out how you did on multiple choice or what your essays were, but when you get your scores, you're going to get a composite score. So because it's 45% of your composite and there's 45 questions, each question's worth 1 point. So the good news is that we want to answer all questions, even if it's a guess. We also don't want to spend too long on any one particular question, because the questions might get easier or whatever as we go. So what's going to happen is you're going to have 2 reading passages. These are going to be longer passages. They're going to be more dense. They used to have it where it was like, okay, you'll have a passage from this time period and this time period and this time period. For Lang, they don't really seem to be doing that anymore. So it's possible you could get something from like the 17 or 1800s and then something else that's more contemporary. It could be that they're both from like the 1900s. We don't know. But they're going to be nonfiction. We do know that. So that's why I said earlier, if you're studying for the SAT or the ACT, some of the questions overlap. So that could be a good way to study. So the reading section is going to be comprehension. The last 3 passages are writing. Those are the new ones. My students tend to like those better. I like them better too, because it's editing. It's not grammar. So it's not the questions like on the SAT or ACT where you have to choose, like, do I need a comma, a colon, a dash, whatever it is. Instead, it's questions like, trying to figure out the best transition word to go there, or like, should the writer add this sentence, yes or no? or maybe trying to like rearrange sentences and things like that. So on the SAT and ACT, if you've taken those before, you might notice that some of the questions have what we call a question stem. Like there's a question above it and it says something like the writer wants to add the following sentence. Those are the types of questions that are on the AP Lang multiple choice. So you got 2 passages of reading, 3 passages of writing. The writing passages are a draft. They're not like a professionally printed text. Whereas and it'll say at the top, this is a draft. Whereas the other stuff, it'll tell you like, okay, this is an excerpt from a book, or this is like an excerpt from a speech or something. So you've got reading and then writing. And so if you're struggling with pacing, one of the things that I have my students do is we look at their subscores. So if you've had the opportunity to take a full practice test, either in class or there's a couple free ones online, one from like Marco Learning that's pretty good. What I would encourage you to do is look at, okay, how many did you get right out of 45? Because for most students, if we're shooting for a 3 composite, our goal is at least 23 out of 45. I know that might sound low if you're used to getting like, if you're an A student, but remember, like this is AP Lang. So we're trying to get a little bit more than half. So 23 out of 45 is not a bad score, especially at this point in the year. So then what I would have you look at is, okay, what was your accuracy for reading? So let's say there were 24 questions. How many out of the 24 did you get right? And then let's say there's 21 writing questions. So how many of those did you get right? Because if you're equally good across the board, that'll tell you some interesting information. If you're stronger at writing than reading, then maybe you want to prioritize those questions. Because really, this is something I wish I understood more when I was a student. But standardized testing is essentially a game. You're trying to get as many points as possible. So that's why I said before, don't linger on any one particular question. It's because they're all worth 1 point. So you don't get any bonus points if it's a super hard question. The other thing is, I can't prove this theory, but I've heard it from other people and I've told my students, and some of them have kind of been like, yeah, that tracks. So sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in AP Lang, if the passage is really hard, the questions are actually a lot easier than you would think. And sometimes if the passage is really easy for reading, then the questions are harder than you would think. Now, I don't know if that's true for everything, but I have heard a lot of people say that. Awesome. So please ask more questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer anything about AP Lang. So if you want to know like how to achieve a certain score, or if you want to know like what you should be studying or how you can prepare, feel free to ask those questions. All right. And if you're on YouTube watching as well, feel free to drop some questions in the chat. I see some familiar names in the chat, but I go live each Sunday. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late this Sunday, but normally it's at 3 p.m. Eastern. What do I do? I'm an AP Lang teacher. And I also create content on TikTok and YouTube to help students prepare for the AP Lang exam. What score on the multiple choice would be in the range of a 5? So that's a good question because it kind of depends on the essays as well. So basically, I would say my students who have gotten a 5 on the exam tend to also get worst case scenario 4s on their essays. Usually they're kind of consistent at the 5, and then like on a good day they get a 6. So just kind of factor that in as well. But my students who tend to make a 5 on the exam for multiple choice, low end, they'd be getting like 35 out of 45. Sometime maybe a little bit lower than that, maybe like a 32, but their essays are really good. So I would say if you're trying for a 5, you want to be between like 35 and 40 out of 45 if possible. But remember, the essays essentially weigh more than the multiple choice because they're 55% of the composite. So that kind of factors in as well. There is like a formula that you can use, and there's online test predictors as well that are pretty accurate. I think Albert.io has one. But basically, I can show you. So like, it's going to probably be backwards for y'all, but this little post-it right here has like the score breakdowns. And so if you're wanting to get a 5, you need approximately 73 to 100 points. 100 is the maximum. So each multiple choice is going to be worth 1 point. And then you take your essay scores and you're going to multiply that by 3.0. I think it's 566. And so you want to get to at least 73 to be in that 5 range, so that you can kind of play around with it and kind of put in your numbers and see, okay, this is what I would make. But yeah, I think most of my students last year that ended up getting a 5 on the exam were anywhere between like 35 and 40 consistently on their multiple choice. What are your favorite introductory activities for argument writing? That's a good question. So, okay, if you're looking for something fun to just, if you're a teacher and you're just trying to like practice, I found that like one way to practice the skills in like a less stressful way is to do like mini debates. So like March is coming up, you could do like March Madness style brackets. I've done this before. So like I do it with like completely like friendly topics. Like we will do like what is the best movie, and so like each quadrant of the bracket is like a different movie genre. We'll do like what's the best like food, or which restaurant has the best fries. I don't know. We choose like sort of like not controversial topics, but like students get really passionate about some of these things. I've also done little things where like I'll ask my students, you know, is a hot dog a sandwich? And I'm trying to think. One year there was one question that they were like super passionate about, and now I can't think of it. But anyway, like if you're a teacher trying to introduce argument, I would say that like start with like fun topics, and then build into the more serious stuff. If you're that way, you can have them practice making a claim and evidence and commentary. You can even work in counter argument skills if you want to, but it keeps it kind of lighthearted. What is the workload in AP Lang like? Okay, that's a great question too. Here's the thing, it's going to depend on who your teacher is. So I can't speak for all teachers. But I personally believe that if my students come to class and give me their best for 45 minutes, which is how long our classes are, I don't assign a lot of homework. And if I do assign homework, I give multiple days to do it because students are busy. You've got responsibilities outside of school, you're on sports teams, clubs, some people have jobs, whatever. I know that not every teacher runs their classroom that way. So the best answer for that question for like your situation is to talk to people who are currently in the class and see what the workload is like. I try to make it more rigorous in terms of like the intellectual stuff that we do, as opposed to like you must write like 17 essays. We do a lot of writing in my class, I'm not going to lie, but it happens in class. So definitely talk to people at your school, because I don't want to mislead you. I don't want to be like, oh, it's just harder work, it's not more work, and then have you find out otherwise. So just talk to the people who are currently in the class, because it is an AP class. So with that does come a certain set of expectations, but I think it varies from school to school. Can you see what your students answered or wrote on the test after they take it? Unfortunately, no. The only year that I know of that, well, okay, let me back up. In 2020, we could, because it was the COVID year, it was digital. And so we got their essays back relatively quickly, and we got to see which prompts they had, because there were like 28 prompts between all the different testing dates and stuff. Now your school can pay, I think you have to pay to get the essay book sent back to you, but you don't get like their individual scores. So we did that my first and second year of teaching AP Lang. We got the test booklets back. So I could look at it and I could know what the student's composite was, because I got that information anyway, and I could see their essays, but there's like the scoring is not on the booklet itself. So AP readers score digitally anyway. Someone has to scan in all the books, and like we have a little thing where like you click the score and stuff. So unfortunately, like even if you do get your test booklets sent back to you for whatever reason, you don't know the exact score that each essay was given. And if you don't have the test booklets sent back to you, then as far as I know, there's not a way to see their scores. Yeah, and then like I know a lot of people ask sometimes like, can you get it like rescored or something like that? And usually the answer is no. But the good news for students is that typically, because of how like the readers work with their table leader, like if there's a question about something, then another person will look at it. So it's, you know, if there is any kind of like, hey, I'm not sure if this meets the expectations of this score, like people are very willing to be like, hey, can I get another set of eyes on this? And table leaders also, they call it back reading. So like they'll go through and just, especially at the very beginning, the first couple days, they double check like, hey, your scores are good. And each day the readers have to recalibrate too. So like, I know a lot of students kind of worry, like, what if I'm scored wrong? But like the College Board has like procedures in place. So I'm pretty confident that people's stuff is scored as accurately as possible. There are some things that you can do to help your reader out though. So like handwriting is big. We can like change the background color of things. So like if it's hard to read it, we can make the background a different color to make it contrast. But like for me personally, I don't think any of my students do it this year, but I've had students in the past who like it's almost like they don't pick up their pen when they write, and it's not cursive, but it's not printing. It's like, and that kind of thing. Like if you could make your letters more distinct, it makes it easier to read. Because remember, if you're taking the paper test, they scan it in. So like take that time. I also have a couple students who have written in all caps. One student just does it anyway. But in the past, I've had a couple students on exam day, because their handwriting was a little iffy, they would write in all caps because it was like neater, because they were having to like pick up their pen. So anyway, like handwriting helps. If you can write neatly, it helps. Can you give advice on how to write better synthesis and argumentative essays? Okay, so like for sophistication in the analysis. Okay, sure. So yes, I'm going to keep continuing the lives. I'm going to go live each week around 3 p.m. Eastern. I was a bit late getting started today, but I will be back on TikTok and YouTube each week for sure. And as the exam gets closer, I'll do them more frequently. So, okay, advice for synthesis and argument. I would say, okay, the thing about argument that people kind of mess up on, if you want to look at it that way, is not having specific enough evidence. I'm working on a video this week about like the common mistakes, if you will. I kind of don't like calling it that, but that people have. And I think for argument, one of the issues is like not selecting evidence that's specific enough, and like really commenting on like what the value of that evidence is. For synthesis, because the sources are there, I feel like people do a better job of that. So I think the real issue comes down to commentary. If you're going for sophistication, there's a few things you can focus on. Some people kind of automatically assume that they should write a counter argument, and that's not necessarily the case. So I would be really careful about the counter argument, because for some students, it kind of feels like they just like throw it in there to go for sophistication, and maybe it's not actually helping their argument. So in those cases, I would rather see a student have like 2 body paragraphs and really develop those body paragraphs, as opposed to trying to throw in a counterclaim and rebuttal or something that maybe isn't helping advance their argument. So like you do not need a counterclaim. Now, can it help a nuanced argument? Absolutely. So I tell my students, like, include it if you think it helps. And during the year, I kind of have them experiment. Like, I think it was like 2 weeks ago, I was like, okay, you have to write a counterclaim in this essay. We planned it in advance because I was like, I just kind of want to see how y'all do, but don't feel like you have to force that one. But the nuanced argument can come from like looking at things and maybe not being as concrete. So sometimes we see people argue like the extremes of the scenario, and sometimes it helps to realize that like, okay, in these cases, this is true, but in these cases, this is true. So it's not necessarily a counter argument. It can be, but kind of looking at like a nuanced perspective. But I think that's something really hard to write under pressure, and it's hard to like force yourself to be nuanced. I would say the broader context is something that applies to both synthesis and argument too. So really be asking yourself, like, why does this issue matter? How does it apply to other scenarios? Short-term, long-term effects. Really connecting it back to society. Sometimes you can also bring up personal experience, and that can be a way to have a broader context as well. So for argument, especially, you can bring up personal experience as long as it's relevant and meaningful. I have seen some students do it in synthesis, but it's more rare. I think it kind of depends on the prompt. The past couple years, they've done prompts that deal with like education. So I feel like students are better able to possibly add in personal experience, but don't go trying to for synthesis. If it comes up, great. But if not, don't force it. But yeah, those would be my tips for that. And then the other thing too is like, I would look at College Board's released sample essays, because I do this with my students. Like I have them look at essays that have gotten the sophistication point, and there's like the essays are in one doc usually, scoring commentaries are in another doc, and we look at like, okay, what did this person do? So before they look at the commentary to see why the College Board gave it the sophistication point, I'll tell them, hey, this one got the point, find some justification for it. And then what they do is they kind of experiment with it in their next essay. And like, so for instance, I found one where it had like kind of what I would consider a vivid and descriptive style. And I have a couple students who are trying to go for that. And so we talked about like, okay, focus on your word choice, vary your syntax, your sentence structure. And so whether they got the sophistication point or not, they've been trying to take that from like that inspiration, if you will, and they're trying to apply it to subsequent essays. So that would be another thing to do. What books do you assign students to read? We don't read many books in my AP Lang class, because my students read books in the other 3 years of high school. And so we read a lot of shorter text. Now, that's not indicative of everybody's AP Lang experience, because some teachers have to assign books. Sometimes they want to. This year, I did independent reading. We're almost done with it. I gave my students a big long list to choose from. And they chose between two. They went for like the murder books. So half the class chose In Cold Blood. They are not liking it, by the way. They are regretting that choice. But some people love In Cold Blood. So it's just not resonating with them, but like they chose their book. The other book that the other half of the class chose, and they like the book, is, I always mess up the title. I call it the FBI book in class. It's something about like flowers of the child moon or children of the flower moon. It has the word flower or children or moon in it. That is not very helpful. I'm sorry. I think the author's last name is like Gran. It's being made into a movie with Leonardo DiCaprio. I know that. But I call it the FBI book in class. But yeah, there's also, so Just Mercy is really popular. Educated is really popular. My other students who are not in AP Lang, but they're in 11th grade, read The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. That one I think kind of was popular about a decade ago and is kind of losing popularity, but I still think it could be a good book depending on what your interests are. But definitely just prioritizing nonfiction. How can AP Lang students get the sophistication point? Okay, so great question. There's essentially like 3 ways to do it. I think the easiest way across the board is this idea of broader context. So when I'm trying to introduce it to my students, that's where I start. Killers of the Flower Moon. Thank you. I knew it had something to do with that. Yes, Killers of the Flower Moon. They like it. It's basically about, okay, I'm paraphrasing here, but like, it has to do with like serial murders in like Oklahoma. And it's one of the first cases the FBI worked. And like my students actually really enjoy it. So they would recommend that one. They are not fans of In Cold Blood. So sophistication, the broader context, it looks a little different depending on which essay we're talking about, but like for rhetorical analysis, broader context can mean a few different things. I tell my students to think about like if it's a historically significant passage, which not all passages are, but if it's connected to like a famous time period or like World War I, World War II, something like that. Or if it's kind of like a social issue, you can, in the commentary possibly, and also in your conclusion, if you write one, you can think about the deeper implications of that. So that would be one way for the broader context. And just really digging into that rhetorical situation. I think that's how most of my students who get the sophistication point in rhetorical analysis, it's usually because they really dig into the rhetorical situation. And so to help with this, I have a video that I put out last week on my channel, and it's all about my best rhetorical analysis sentence frames. If you haven't checked out that video, it is a little bit long, but it's because I go through the different sentence frames, and some of them are commentary sentence frames that could possibly help. But really thinking about why the writer is making that choice for that audience on that occasion. So broader context, like historical significance, or if you're asked about the message, ask yourself, like, how is this message relevant today? And I would save that for maybe the conclusion or some concluding commentary, but that could be a broader context way. Now, I'm not promising you'll get the sophistication point just by answering those questions, but it can definitely help. That's the good thing, is usually when you're trying for sophistication, even if you don't get the point, it usually helps your commentary. The other thing you can do for sophistication is focus on your style. And I think this works for those who are like more of like the creative writing type. First thing you should do is omit lower level words from your writing. So good, bad, thing, stuff. I don't think people use stuff very much, but really very huge. I feel like huge is just not very precise, and we see that a lot. So get those words out and use synonyms. Then start to try to include words correctly that are higher level. And I would say also focus on your writing style, your syntax. So try to include like a semicolon correctly, colons or dashes correctly. Don't go crazy with it, but just like in a meaningful way, try to incorporate that. And that could help your style as well. Again, I'm not guaranteeing the point, but it could help. And then also with rhetorical analysis, you can examine the complexities or the tensions. So I feel like this works better with some prompts than others, but if there's like some kind of tension between the speaker and the audience, examine that, or like maybe like external tensions, like socially, or like what's going on in the world at the time. And then those same things kind of apply to argument and synthesis just differently. Like the style tips go, I think you can still apply those, but broader context for argument and synthesis is probably going to be more like really digging into why this issue matters, how it applies to society, short-term, long-term, things like that. I do have some videos about like sophistication, but I am going to be redoing them with like more concrete examples and things like that. So just be on the lookout for those. I'm shooting for like April for those videos because I want to do them over my spring break and give them the time and attention they deserve. Let's see. So on YouTube, we've got a question. What about using these books or Netflix for argument evidence? Yes, you can. So I use the acronym CHORES. I know other teachers use like ReHugo, Gopher is one. There's another one, but they all amount to the same thing. So for me, CHORES stands for current events, history, outside knowledge, reading, experience, and science. And so yes, you can use like under reading, I let my students use like podcasts because if you've listened to the Serial podcast, I haven't made it through all of it, but I was listening to like the season 1. I listened to maybe like 4 or 5 episodes. You could use that because it's going to be really specific evidence depending on the prompt. So and like you can also reference pop culture. Like here's the thing that I wish maybe more people understood, and by people I mean teachers. I think sometimes we kind of like scoff at certain types of evidence, like, oh, that's not very academic. But like you have never seen the prompt before and you've got 40 minutes. And like I joke with my students about this because we were doing we did a prompt about competition, and then like the week after we did exploring the unknown, and we did something that is overrated. And like I have a group of like cheerleaders and dancers in the class, and I watched like every season of Dance Moms possible. So fun fact about me. And I was like, listen, guys, for some of these prompts, like as much as I would love to write about some fantastic historical figure, if I were in your like position and I just had to write an essay, Dance Moms is probably the first thing that would come to mind. Now, and I would just write the best essay I could with that. And they laughed at me and like in a friendly way. And I was like, I'm giving you permission to write about what you think is the best evidence at the time. Like, please don't think you have to write about all these fancy topics. Write about what you know well. And if that's something on Netflix, go for it. You know, now granted, like keep in mind, because I've seen students pair some really unique things too. Like, so maybe you do know something historical and maybe you can relate it to a current event. So be selective with your evidence. I'm not saying just write about Netflix shows or something, but I hope that people realize that in the moment, like sometimes those are the ideas that come to us. And I would rather have you be specific because you know the topic well than be reaching. Because like one year, so I grade for our state too. We have like a state mock exam that some schools participate in. And I think it was like the striving for perfection prompt. For whatever reason, seemed like probably 40% of the people wrote about Edison, but you could tell from how they were writing about Edison. It was like, oh, like he invented the light bulb and it took him like, I don't know, 10,000 tries or whatever. People made up all kinds of numbers. But like, you could tell that they hadn't studied Edison since like 4th grade. And it was just like, oh, perfection, Edison, like, you know. And so if don't include stuff that you can't write about very specifically. Like we want the dates, we want the concrete details, that kind of thing. So I would rather you choose something pop culture that you could write about well, as opposed to like this figure that you maybe learned about in elementary school. Just personal preference. Other people might disagree. But in one of my recent videos, on TikTok, it was like some trending audio or something. And I made a comment about the timely decisions prompt because my students are about to have to do that one. They don't know that unless they're on this live. But a lot of students last year found it really hard, and I tend to agree. And so people who took the test last year were commenting in the comments about what they actually wrote about. And I'm seeing so many pop culture references. And I just find it funny because even if I don't know the TV show they're referring to, like if I'm reading your essay and you clarify that kind of stuff, then it can be a good essay. So just if you're writing about pop culture, just assume that your reader does not know what you're talking about and make sure you connect the dots for them. Even if you're writing about something like that is sort of obvious, still connect the dots for them. Let's see, we've got some questions here. Do our own AP Lang teachers grade our AP tests? No. So we don't know whose tests we're grading because you all get like an ID number and it's like super complicated. And I don't know my students' AP IDs. If we think for whatever reason we know the person, we have to like flag that and it goes to somebody else. At my state mock, we all have a different code number. So I know my code. And so I know if it's my student and I just give it to somebody else. But for the actual AP test, no, they don't grade. Also, the likelihood is really slim because my students always ask me that, like for the past couple of years that I've been a reader, they're like, what if you get one of our essays? And I'm like, listen, like, I'm not going to know. I'm not going to know it's you. I'm probably not going to recognize your handwriting. Your writing style is going to seem like other people's. So like, I'm not going to know. So yeah. Let's see. Now, obviously in class during the year, your teacher can grade your stuff. What are some rhetorically strong verbs? Okay, good question. So if you're trying for commentary, I recommend instead of shows, demonstrates, conveys, highlights, illustrates, underscores, which means emphasizes. So emphasizes works. As far as like rhetorically accurate verbs, some of the ones that I see that are most common would be things like compares, repeats. So we want to say like repeats and not uses repetition. Instead of saying like, if you're trying to talk about like the emotional appeal, instead of saying like uses pathos or pathos, you want to say something like, evokes a sense of, and then tell us the emotion, or elicits a sense of and tell us the emotion. You could say like provides facts. I know provides is not like a super fancy verb, but like provides or includes facts, statistics, an anecdote, whatever it is. Vividly describes. So if you're talking about detail, you can say like describes, or details can be a verb too. So those are some of the ones that are more common. Like underscores is one, something you taught me. Yeah, I did a video about that because a lot of like, I had a question a couple years ago where it said underscores, and I asked my students like, okay, which answer choices do we know are wrong? Like, what can we get rid of? And they're like, that one. And I was like, why? And they were like, well, because it's like, I think they confused it with undermine, and like that's the opposite. And I was like, oh no, underscores is kind of like underlining it, like you're emphasizing it. And then it ended up being the right answer for the question. So I was like, okay, note to self, make sure people know what underscores means. There was another one, and I wrote it down somewhere, and now I can't remember what it is, but I'll make a TikTok when I do. But there was another word that came up quite a lot where students like misunderstood it. I know it's in one of my old videos, so I'll have to find it. But yeah, there's just a couple words where like they come up and students are like, wait, what does that mean? One of them is exigence. I was working with a tutoring student, and one of the AP Lang questions was like, what is the exigence of the passage? And it was a multiple choice question. And they were like, wait, what's that? So in case anyone doesn't know, exigence is like the catalyst. So context is like the historical timeline, if you will. And then exigence is the immediate reason why they're speaking. And so I use the acronym SPACE, or like Space Cat. Some of you might be familiar with that. But I do believe students need to know what exigence is because I've seen it in a couple of multiple choice questions. I do have a video. It's maybe more for like the beginning of the year, but it's something about like AP Lang terms that you need to know. And some of the stuff in there, if you've taken the class, you already know, like claim, evidence, commentary, but there's other terms in that video. And if you don't want to watch the whole video, I think I included like a doc in the video of like all the terms. I think I did. If I was smart, I did. That would have been a nice thing to do for people. Okay, let's look at a couple of these over here. So asked to fill in AP 2 months ago before the test, getting baselines tomorrow. Oh, thank you. I'm so glad to hear that it's helpful. They're all worried about commentary. Yes, commentary is like the hardest part. I think it's the hardest part for teachers and students, but it's also super important. Here's one thing that I've noticed is that commentary, students develop their commentary over the year. So like we still have time. We've got like 73 days. So like if you're still like, my commentary is not so great, that's okay. Like we can work on that between now and the test. It's important that we understand what commentary is. The College Board kind of explains it as explaining the significance of evidence, which I sort of think is helpful, but I also sort of think that's kind of not helpful as a definition. So what I tell my students to do is ask why, how, and so what. Usually why, but sometimes how and so what make more sense. And keep channeling that. Like I tell them to channel their inner toddler, which if you've ever been around like a 3-year-old and like you say something and they ask you why, and then you answer and then they ask you why again, do that with your essays. Use the word because indicates why. And here's the thing about commentary is it doesn't like, obviously we want it to be insightful. We want it to be developed, but point blank, it has to be there first. Because I've had some students be like, well, I'm worried it's going to be too repetitive. It may very well be, and we can work on that later, but you got to get something down. So ask yourself why, how, or so what. And then specifically with rhetorical analysis, really try to connect it to the rhetorical situation. So ask yourself, why is the writer making this choice for this audience on this occasion? And when I present this to students, I kind of talk about how, like if my students are asking me a question, they're probably going to ask it with different verbiage than if they're going to ask the person at the table next to them. So like when your audience changes, the choices you make change. When the situation changes, the choices you make change. Like for instance, if a student is going to email me because an assignment's late, they're going to be making different rhetorical choices if they're just going to ask me a question about an assignment. So same audience, but different occasion. So we kind of play like that, like, okay, in these scenarios, your choices change because of the audience or the situation. Think about what the writer is doing in those cases as well. So yeah, but getting a baseline at this point in the year is really helpful. Our students they started their mock exam. They're about to finish their mock exam next week. And so we use that to kind of figure out where they are. And then as a teacher, I kind of plan, like we've got one more unit that we're doing. And then the last 3-ish weeks before the exam, I turn it over to my students and I'm like, what do y'all want to learn? What do y'all want to practice? And I just kind of let them decide. So yeah, there's still plenty of time to work on commentary. When do you typically host a mock exam for your students? Oh, okay. So yeah, I kind of just answered that, but I didn't see that question there. So a mock exam is okay, teachers do it very differently. For my students, we do a mock exam for our state. I live in Arkansas. Not all Arkansas schools do this. So if you happen to be from Arkansas and you're like, we don't do that, it's probably because you're not part of this like cohort of schools that we have. So my students do a full-length multiple choice as their semester test. So they've already done it. There's 3 on AP Classroom, so I just pick one of those. They do the other 2 throughout the year as well. So that I take that number and then they write a synthesis, and hopefully none of my students are on here right now, but it will. We use the previous year's test. So they did the synthesis. They knew it was a synthesis. I kind of prepped them for it without telling them the prompt, but then they had to sit and write it. And so what they're about to do on Tuesday, because we have an after school study session, so that's how our school does it, is they're about to write question 2 and question 3. And I like to have them do it back to back because I think students should try to do a double, I call it like a double essay between like now and the exam, because my class period is only 45 minutes. I know some people have like 80-minute classes, but the most my students can ever do is 1 essay. So when we have these after school study sessions, we have 2 in the spring. So 1 in February, 1 in April. I have them write 2 essays back to back for prompts they haven't seen before, because I want them to get used to managing their time. Because on the real AP test, you have 2 hours and 15 minutes for your FRQs, your essays. And so if you want to spend 45 minutes on 1 essay, that's cool and that's fine. But then those 5 minutes extra, if you will, have to come from somewhere. So that's why we do it that way. So a mock exam is basically just like a practice test. And you can, if you're a student and your teacher doesn't do it for you, one place I'd recommend looking is Marco Learning. They have a free practice test and you can just take a weekend, time yourself, score it, that kind of thing. So it can be really helpful. I don't think it's crucial, but as a teacher, I think it's helpful. I get good data from it. Let's see. So yeah, we're finishing up our mock exam this coming week, and then we score it the week after. How sensitive or inappropriate essay topics, reading passages, are they more abstract? Okay, I think was there a previous part to that question, or am I misunderstanding? I might be misunderstanding. Okay, so I think I might be misunderstanding your question, so I'm going to attempt to answer it. And if I'm not understanding it correctly, please correct me. I don't think the College Board chooses sensitive topics. I think they purposely try to avoid that. So don't be leery of like, what if I'm going to be asked to write about something? I think they choose stuff that's like pretty like middle of the road. Now, as a student, could you take that and then like go that way with it? And yeah, absolutely. And some students do, and that's fine. Just remember, the people reading your essay they're AP readers. The one thing that we all have in common is that we are teachers of some sort. Usually it's high school AP teachers, but some of them are college professors. But we all come from different areas of the country. We all come from different walks of life. We are not supposed to project our beliefs onto our students' essays. We're supposed to be unbiased. So if you're going to argue something, argue it well. But yeah, the topics are more abstract. So like the prompts lately, especially over the past like 5 years. So like last year was like about timely decisions. So like essentially like the value of timely decisions. There has been like the value of exploring the unknown, the value of striving for perfection. So they're all kind of abstract concepts. Some of them are a bit more philosophical than others. So like on AP Classroom, they tend to have some prompts that are kind of like there's one about voting and stuff. And like, so they've been leaning towards the more abstract. Now, here's the thing that could change, right? So like it could be that like this year it's less abstract. But like the idea of argument doesn't change. So you need your thesis, you need specific evidence and specific commentary. But like in the past few years, they've definitely leaned more and even longer than that, they've leaned more towards the abstract, which I tend to like. And I feel like that makes more sense for the test because not everybody has the same background experiences. So if we ask something like sensitive or controversial, like that's not really fair. I say we, I'm not part of the testing committee. I took a mock exam last year for US history and ended up doing pretty well on the exam. Yeah, I think it can be really helpful. I think it helps students if they like it, depending on how your teacher does it, it can help you get a ballpark score. I know our APUSH teacher does one and so does our AP World teacher, but theirs are in April because they have like timeline content to get through. Whereas mine is more skill-based. So in AP Lang, I do it sooner than they do. That's all. But yeah, it can be very helpful as far as like practicing your pacing and knowing where you stand. I will say this though, like just because you get a certain score on your mock does not mean for better or for worse that you get that score on your real essay or your real exam. So like last year, I had a couple students score a 3 on their mock and they scored a 4 or a 5 on the real one. But I've also had kids go the other direction. So it's a good, like you want to be confident and you want to use it to help you. But at the same time, like don't get overly confident. Like, I don't know, don't stress out about it, a mock exam too much. I just started AP Lang in January. Do you have any tips for developing commentary? Yes. It kind of depends on which essay you're talking about, but ask yourself why, how, or so what, and really think about why what you're saying matters and really explain that evidence. So for rhetorical analysis, ask yourself, why is the writer making this choice for this audience on this occasion? If you want rhetorical analysis commentary help, I have a video on my channel and it's called something like my best rhetorical analysis tip. It's a little bit of a longer video, but if you type in like Coach Hall writes my best rhetorical analysis tip or my best RA tip, hopefully it comes up. I think other videos might come up instead. And I do have other commentary videos, but that one is specifically about like digging deeper with your commentary and stuff. Also the video that I put out last week is like rhetorical analysis sentence frames. And some of those sentence frames in the video can also help get to commentary. And I think I linked the RA tip video in last week's video, I think. But yeah, commentary is going to be the tricky part. So for rhetorical analysis, that would be my tip. But for synthesis and argument, really think about why the evidence you chose matters and like what we're supposed to learn from it. Because you had to have chosen it for a reason. It's supposed to be proving your thesis. So like really connect the dots. Like don't assume that your reader knows why that is important because they can't infer. So that's the other thing is like there are times when I read an essay and like the student will have their claim and their evidence and like maybe a little bit of commentary and it's like, okay, I know why you think this is a good example, but like I can't give you credit for stuff that's not on the page. So like when in doubt, explicitly say it. Just because like I would rather see, I know it's like less sophisticated, but I would rather see someone say this is important because, or this is significant because. I know it's not like maybe as higher level writing, but at least if you tell me why it matters, I can at least like put you in contention for a higher score for commentary. But if you're making me like kind of infer why and you don't ever say it, then I can't necessarily award you points for that. As a teacher, at least, like that's what I tell my students is like, especially my students who are kind of on the border of like a 3 out of 6 or a 4 out of 6 for their essays. I'm like, I would rather at this point in the year, I'd rather you be like very on the money and like prove to me that you know it rather than thinking like, oh, she'll know what I'm talking about. Awesome. If you are watching on TikTok and you wouldn't mind, just tap your screen a couple times to give this some likes. It would be great if we could get it up to like 1K likes. And I'll stay on for a little while longer to answer some questions. How would you use ethos in a sentence? Because I don't want to say the author uses ethos. Okay, good. So yeah, you're right. We don't want to say that. So here's what we could say instead. So remember, ethos is an appeal to ethics or credibility. Thank you for the hearts and the likes on TikTok. So I would say it really depends on what is happening, but I would say something like the author bolsters means like strengthens. So the author bolsters their credibility by, or the author, and use their name, don't call them the author. But like, you could even say appeals to credibility. That's a little bit like, it's better than uses ethos, but I would just say like bolsters their credibility by, or strengthens their credibility by. And I feel like those phrases are better than like uses ethos. I don't think Indiana has a mock exam. They might not. Like our state is kind of unique for that, but like not every school in our state does it. But lots of teachers do a mock exam even if your state doesn't. So it's very possible that your teacher might do it, because all they really have to do is just put together like a test of prompts from like previous years. So, and you can even kind of make your own at home if you want to. Just look at like past exam prompts. So it's possible that your teacher will do it even if your state doesn't have one. I actually think we're one of the few states that does something like this. I think they said that last time. Does AP Lang MCQ always have 5 answer choices? Yes. So like SAT and ACT have 4, but AP Lang is 5. And at first, when I started teaching AP, I was like, oh, that makes it harder. But now that I've thought about it more and taught it more, I honestly think it kind of makes it easier, because you know that at least 1 or 2 of the answer choices are complete throwaway. Like if you've read the passage and you've read the question, they do not make sense. So then I would like literally cross those out, use process of elimination. Then you've got usually one that's kind of like, it uses words from the passage, but like isn't actually right. They do that a lot. Like it'll be like, okay, this word that you've seen in the passage, they like put that in the answer choice, but like it might not be right. They do that on the SAT, I've noticed too. And then like you've got 2, and that's where I think students get stuck a lot, is like, they're like, okay, I've narrowed it down to 2. So which one is it? And that's where you got to be really careful, because you want to look at the word choice of the answers. So like sometimes the answer could be true, but it's not answering the question. Sometimes the answer could be true, but it's not true to it's like too broad, or in some cases it's too specific. So like sometimes one word can make an answer wrong. And I think that's probably like the hard part about it. But like you really want to nitpick the word choice. If you can narrow it down to 2, just ask yourself, like literally, like what is the best answer to the question being asked? I wish they had like more stuff available online for that. Like I don't make a lot of multiple choice videos because of copyright and stuff. But I wish they had like more free AP Lang questions from the College Board out there. There are 17 total questions in this huge PDF called the Course Exam Description. So if you're looking for practice, those are out there. Marco Learning has a free practice test that I've used with some of my tutoring students, and they have done well with it. But AP Classroom, honestly, I think is like the best place for those questions. Unfortunately, as students, you can't necessarily access that. But if your teacher can assign it, I personally like the AP Classroom questions. Whenever we get to, I don't do a ton of them with my students, but whenever they do them, I like the data that I get. I got 3 6s in a row in rhetorical analysis. Thank you so much for your help. Oh, you're welcome. Congratulations. A 6 is hard. So that's very reassuring. Congratulations. My teacher says to use elimination to get rid of the choices, so it's easier to figure out the answer. Yeah, I agree. Especially if you're like a nervous test taker, or you're like stressed out, like getting rid of them can help, because you don't want to be looking at all 5 answer choices. I don't know what study this was, but someone told me once that like we tend to look at like top to bottom, and like even if you know A is wrong, if you just cross out like the A and not cross through the whole answer, you still read A every time. And so I think that's kind of true. Like if I think back to how I took tests as a high school student, I might have like reread answer choices that I had already eliminated. So I tell my students to like cross through the whole thing. And I tell them like as you're going down it, like if you know it's wrong, cross it out. If you're not sure, leave it. But sometimes like when I'm tutoring, if I know it's a hard question, I do this in my class too. I'll say like, okay, don't try to tell me the right answer right away. Try to tell me 2 answer choices that you know are automatically wrong. Because then when students are like, okay, this and this are wrong, and I ask them why and they can tell me, then we can work toward the right answer. So sometimes it's not about like looking through it and like, oh, that's the right answer. Sometimes it's about working backwards and using process of elimination. How is the test graded? So the AP Lang exam has essentially two parts. Part one is multiple choice. There are 45 questions. You have 1 hour. Each multiple choice question is worth 1 point because it's 45% of your overall score. That's your composite. So we'll talk about that in a second. And then your FRQs, which are your essays, there are 3 of them. There's a rubric. You get a score of, I guess, technically 0 to 6, 6 being the highest. And those scores get multiplied by approximately 3.0566. Then all that gets added together. And then based on the number of points you get, the College Board gives you a composite. So the composite is the score that you actually see. It's going to be a number 1 through 5. And that's like what they tell you. And then that's what they tell, if you have it reported to colleges, that's what they tell colleges, and you can potentially get college credit. You can usually get, each year you can usually send your scores for free. There's like a deadline for it. I don't know all the specifics for this year, like what the deadline is or the process, but definitely talk to either your guidance counselors, your AP teachers, or your AP coordinators. Or when it gets closer to the exam and like this summer, and I know the dates myself, I can tell y'all. My students who know that they're going to a certain school, and they're pretty confident about how they're going to do, I just usually have them send their scores. Try to take it. If you get an opportunity, a free opportunity to send your scores somewhere to a school, try to take advantage of that. But I know some people like to wait and see what they've gotten and things like that. So it just kind of depends. A lot of my students also take like a concurrent credit class that I teach like as seniors. And so this year, if they're doing that, we're just going to recommend that they send their scores to the college that we partner with, because they'll just save them a step later. But that's just kind of like a personal thing. I don't know that that applies to everybody. How many sentences do you think each body paragraph should have? I tend to like to see more developed body paragraphs with like, I tend to try to not put a number on it, but I would say like 6 is probably the minimum. Most of my students probably write like 8 to 10, but I guess the way I teach it is more of more development. Some of my students do way more than 10, I think. I don't count their sentences, but based on maybe their handwriting is just big. I don't know. But I've got a couple students who will write like very, very long essays. But my average students, they do like 2 body paragraphs, not 3. I think it's a time management thing. And I also feel like it's just the more I've taught it, the more I guess I've told my students it's okay to have 2. I feel like the more they've done that, like when I first started teaching AP Lang, a lot more of my students did 3, but now I think they're more systematic and they do 2, but the paragraphs are longer. They're more developed, if that makes sense. So yeah, any other AP Lang questions? Thank y'all for asking such good questions. So I'll be live each week. I go live at 3 p.m. Eastern. If I'm ever not live, chances are something came up, but I will be live later that day. Like today, I was like 20 minutes late, so I'm sorry. But I go live on TikTok and YouTube each week. And then as the exam approaches, I'll be going live with Tim Freitas from the Garden of English. We're going to go live on his channel. And so those dates will be announced soon. Like we actually like just planned them, but we haven't posted them yet. And I also will be going live on YouTube and TikTok as the exam gets closer. So right now it's just Sundays, but come end of April, beginning of May, I'll definitely be going live more frequently because I feel like there will be more questions and stuff. Let's see. How many rhetorical choices or devices should you speak about in your thesis? At least 2, possibly 3. It kind of depends on like how many body paragraphs you want. So in general, if you intend to do 2 body paragraphs, I would expect to see 2 rhetorical choices. If you're going to do 3, I would expect to see 3. Now, if you put 3 and you only get to 2, just like go up and cross the 3rd one out. No one will care. It's fine. It's okay. But also remember that rhetorical choices can be more broad. So we want to favor verbs, but like you could say something like, creates a common enemy. And you could talk about, as you're talking about that, you could talk about like their word choice or contrast or whatever it is. So, I usually tell my students that like, if you have 2 main ideas, I want to see 2 choices in your thesis. but like sometimes choices kind of work together. So it's okay to bring up others, but like don't just stuff a bunch of choices or like devices or something into your thesis. It makes it like more confusing. So just have rhetorical choices in there, usually 2 to 3. For argumentative essays, is a counter argument necessary? Nope, it is not. Some teachers make you write it, and that's their business. But like I think it's a good skill to know, but no, it's not required. So I tell my students only include it if you think it's going to help your actual argument. Because sometimes it feels really forced, and it feels like maybe the student could have just developed their other points better as opposed to like trying to do the counter argument. I used to tell my students like, oh, it's okay if you're going to do 3 paragraphs, you can start with the counter argument and then whatever. But the more I've taught it, the more I see students doing it as the last paragraph. And I think that makes more sense. And the reason why is because if you ran out of time, that could just be omitted and your paper would still be good. So you don't have to include it. If it's going to help your essay, then sure. But if it's not going to help your essay or if you run out of time, it's not mandatory. And it's also not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed to give you sophistication either. I think that's why a lot of people try to include it. I've been struggling a lot with MCQ. My scores are getting worse. Do you have any tips? Okay, so what are you doing to study? Is it your progress checks that you're talking about? Is it the full length test on AP Classroom that maybe your teachers assigned? I think it's helpful to kind of look at the right answers if you have access to them and really kind of think about, okay, like why is this the right answer and that kind of thing, and look for trends. So are you missing more of the reading questions? Are you missing more of the writing questions? And then look for like trends and what you're missing and maybe try to isolate those skills and work on those skills. But multiple choice is hard. I personally think the writing questions are easier than the reading questions. So if you're trying to like start with something to get better at it, I would start with the writing questions. But you can use SAT and ACT tests to study as well. The thing I like about the SAT is they have release tests with answer explanations. Now, I'm going to be honest, some of the answer explanations are not super helpful because they're like, the answer is A because it just is. Like, that's what it feels like. But sometimes they do really good quality answer explanations. So yeah, any other questions about AP Lang? If you think of something afterwards, like feel free to like message on TikTok. I'm going to be trying to post like a video or 2 a day on TikTok. So it really helps when people ask questions because then I can respond to the question and make new content. So if you ever have questions on TikTok, then please just like ask a question on a recent video. And that way I can like know what people need help with. And I'm going to be working on making TikTok playlists soon. I have to figure out how to do that. But I got to the point where I should have that capability now. Thank you, everyone, for liking and following and all that. But I'm going to organize my playlist so that way, if you're wanting just tips on a certain topic, kind of like how I have on YouTube, like I have a rhetorical analysis playlist. I have a cram for the exam playlist. Like I think it's easier for students, sometimes playlists there as well. But I know the playlist can kind of get overwhelming because there's like more in them. So hopefully that'll work out for people. And then also I'll be going live each week, Sunday, 3 p.m. Eastern. And then as the exam gets closer, I'll be doing more lives. I'll also be offering some like workshops and stuff on other platforms if people are interested. So the like more information about that to come, but I'll try to include that in my profile if people want like one-on-one help or a group class or something. But I really like these Q&As because it's a great way to answer just general questions people have. Is it good to stand out in argument essays? I would say yes. I mean, it kind of depends on how, but like I'm going to be really honest. Like we read with argument essays, like I feel like people use the same examples all the time. And that's not bad. Like I think there are times when I would choose like the common examples too. So like if you can stand out, it depends on what you mean by stand out. If you mean stand out by like choosing unique evidence, then I would say go for it if you can write about it well. If you mean like trying to use like a satirical sense of humor or something, yeah, that can stand out, but it can also backfire. So like just make sure that you're standing out for like a positive reason that's going to help your score. But yeah, it's nice, but like I don't think you have to go to like extremes to stand out. Let me give you a quick example of like how. So like if you've heard my lives before, I'm sure I've said this, but at our state mock exam probably 3-4 years ago, a student wrote, the prompt was the overrated prompt. So they had to choose one thing that was overrated in it and explain why it was overrated. And I read an essay that I think ended up getting like a 131. And it was because the student wrote about the basketball player Russell Westbrook being overrated. Now, I do not watch much basketball. I do not watch NBA basketball. So I had no clue who this player was. But the student wrote it almost like parts of it felt like sports journalism. Like they clearly were a basketball fan and like really felt passionately about this. And so it was very convincing. Like with a few tweaks, I feel like this could have been like published on like some kind of like sports journalism website. It was so like it stood out to me because when everybody else was writing about like, I don't know, Kim Kardashian being overrated, like this was still a celebrity, but it was somebody new. And like you could tell the person really like was passionate about the topic and very informed. So they stood out. So standing out doesn't have to be as hard as maybe it sounds, if that makes sense. For rhetorical analysis, how much textual evidence should we use? Your quotes should be short. A lot of times people choose these huge quotes and it really kind of messes up the ratio of evidence to commentary. So embed your evidence, meaning like take short quotes and put it into a sentence of your own. Keep the quotes kind of short. I tell my students to have layers. So like claim, topic sentence, evidence, commentary, concluding sentence. That's kind of the minimum. So I like to see at least 2 pieces of evidence per paragraph to really prove. Now, if you're like, okay, wait a minute, what if I'm analyzing like an anecdote and there's only one anecdote? Okay, that's fine. Just choose 2 different quotes from the same anecdote, like, you know, the little snippets. That's why the short quotes really helps. Whereas if it's like repetition, like look at, like you might be talking about, okay, that she repeats the phrase persevere, but like give us 2 different times when she did it and analyze those different times kind of thing. So I would say 2. Some students write more than 2 and it's very like it's more advanced and it's kind of like woven in more, if that makes sense. But I would say a minimum of 2 because I feel like 1 piece of evidence in a paragraph is less convincing. So even if you're talking about like one example or one anecdote or something, you can still pull different quotes, shorter quotes from the same thing. Also, to improve your commentary, really look at like the word choice in detail. So like if you're quoting something, let's say there's like 5 or 6 words in your quote, like look at the word choice within the quote. So even if you're analyzing like repetition or comparison, that's fine. But as part of you analyzing why they're comparing that or why they're repeating that, look at the word choice too, and maybe connect it to something like tone, and that could deepen your analysis as well. So usually we want to see a small portion of evidence and a larger portion of commentary. But I like to see it kind of layered. Not everybody writes it that way, but that's just my advice. I do have a video on my channel about how to write a rhetorical analysis body paragraph that might show you that skill and some of those tips I've been talking about in like a better example. So I would encourage you to check out that video as well. And if you need to know how to embed evidence, I have some videos about that because that applies to synthesis and rhetorical analysis. Don't just drop your quotes in, please. It's really jarring for AP readers and just teachers in general. Like just embed your evidence. It shows that like a little bit more finesse to your writing too. All right, let me see if I skipped any questions. If you have any final questions, feel free to ask. But I think I've gotten everybody's. Oh, we're at 1.9 likes. We're close to 2K. I don't even know how much likes matter, but like, and I just like numbers. Like I like round numbers, I guess. All right, any more questions on YouTube? I think I answered everything that was here. All right, awesome. Well, if nobody has any more final questions, then feel free to reach out if there's any way I can be of assistance. So feel free to comment on a video. If you have questions, I can respond on TikTok. I can respond on YouTube too. It's just not always as easy, and things like that. And then feel free to join in future lives, and I would be happy to help that way as well. All right, awesome. Well, I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. If you're just joining us, sorry, we're about to close out, but we will be live. I will be live next week at 3 p.m. Eastern to answer AP Lang questions. So yeah, and in the meantime, just feel free to comment on any of my videos and ask questions that you might have. All right, bye everybody.